Rage bait used to be believable. Look, I think it's fair to say gaming journalism isn't seeing the best of lights anymore. And when it comes to gaming journalism, there's no player in the game better at uniting everyone against them than Kotaku. And we have another gem. Rage bait that feels so pure and raw that it unites everyone in the Final Fantasy fandom seemingly against them. And I want to go over these thoughts and these impressions today, because this is a doozy. Final Fantasy doesn't need turn-based combat back, it needs better stories. The next entry shouldn't take the wrong lessons from Clay Obscure Expedition 33. This title is so well crafted to create internet discussion and to rile people up, it's incredible. I have not seen an article or anything created in the last 5 or so years better constructed to tick people off regardless of their opinions and thoughts about Final Fantasy than this right here. Like, this is next level stuff. Not only does it tick off the people that want turn-based combat back, but it also ticks off the more modern audience that really enjoys the stories that Final Fantasy puts out. It brings Expedition 33 into the discussion as well. Like, this just perfectly irritates the old god and the new god for Final Fantasy fans. It's incredible. And while I know most people will just simply read that headline and just move on about their day, I want to get at the meat and potatoes. I want to get at the DNA of the matter, to delve into this article and see what points they want to bring up. Now, I have perused this, and trust me, this gets juicy. This gets spicy. Now, I don't want to read every word in this article. I'll leave a link in the description down below, but let's just head to the juiciest, choicest bits. The article leads off with people talking about their reactions to Clay Obscure Expedition 33 and how people want similar treatment out of Final Fantasy. Then it transitions into recapping what Naoki Yoshida, Final Fantasy XVI producer, talked about in interviews at Anime Expo 2025 that I've also covered on this channel, and particularly highlights one quote. With this question of turn-based versus action, again from Naoki Yoshida, it tends to isolate the gameplay to just the battle system, he responded. That doesn't take into account what kind of game the creators want to deliver to players. For example, based on a certain graphical quality we want to present to our players, or the narrative we want to deliver to our players. It relates to how we set up the game systems around it. This includes the battle system, game design, and gameplay feel. It's not a clear-cut answer whether it will become all turn-based or if it's going to become more action-based. I'm not necessarily going to be on Final Fantasy XVII, so we also don't want to obstruct or limit our future director or whomever will be producing the games like 17 or even 18. We don't want to put them on a rail. Something I think a lot of the conversations lording Clay Obscure over Final Fantasy's head miss are that combat isn't where the latter has faltered in recent years. Final Fantasy XVI's arcade-like real-time action is flashy, precise, and incredibly satisfying. The only real shortcomings were that it didn't dive deeper into some of the underlying systems. More icon ability synergies, elemental damage, more varied equipment options, and it wasn't hard enough. Each of those is easily iterated on in a sequel, as the series has done throughout its history. Just remember that for when we get back to it. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth offers an even bigger rebuttal to the turn-based question in my mind, because that's essentially still what it is. Final Fantasy combat has long operated on a continuum between static and real-time, going back to the series' introduction of the ATB system to let enemies act independent of player decision-making. This is why Square Enix often refers to Rebirth as a command combat system. While you can move around in battles and positioning is important, the most important tasks are all automated by the characters themselves and carried out by selecting them from a menu. There are dodges, parries, synergies, summons, and all the rest, but at its core, it's already working off the same logic as Clay Obscure's combat system, and in much more robust ways. Okay, so there's like little bits to this that I agree with, and large swaths that I disagree with. Let's start with Final Fantasy XVI. I would agree that Final Fantasy XVI's combat is pretty good. It's not my favorite combat system of all time, but it is enjoyable for what it is. I do have my issues with it. I think the icon abilities you get in the later portions of the game are rather slow and dull, and not as interesting as the ones you unlock earlier in the game. I wish the game had fleshed out its regular combo system and wasn't so reliant on icon abilities. And yes, I agree, more varied equipment options would be nice to see. And yes, that stuff is easily iterated on in a sequel. With that, I agree with the article. However, what I disagree is the idea we'll ever necessarily see that combat system again. Because while those ideas are easily iterated on in a sequel, we don't see much iteration on combat systems in modern Final Fantasy outside of Final Fantasy XIV, which is a live service MMORPG, and the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, because those games are directly connected to one another. Final Fantasy XV and XVI have wildly different combat systems. They behave and function completely differently. So the defense of this combat system, predicated on the idea that, oh, they'll do it again in the future with another game, I don't believe to be an ironclad defense because, well, this is an older Final Fantasy, where they largely stuck with an overarching structure for a combat system and just iterated on that idea. Every new game they put out feels so fundamentally different to one another, at least gameplay-wise and combat-wise. And while I do think and agree with the idea that the first half, or even first 3/4 of Final Fantasy XVI's combat are pretty dang good, for me it hasn't aged the best because I find the combat to become way too one-dimensional as the game goes on. Yeah, you can technically do a bunch of flashy combos, but it never feels as if you're rewarded for doing so unless you're doing a score attack mode, which isn't the main game. Personally, I really enjoy Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and its combat system. I think it's great. However, I don't like trying to directly compare it to Expedition 33 and saying they're essentially the same. Just because a game has a dodge and parry system, and because a lot of the names cross over between the games, doesn't mean the games function the same. While Final Fantasy VII Rebirth does operate with the ATB system, it still feels at its core like a real-time action RPG. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but that's what it feels like. That's the pace, that's the flow, that's the strategy of the game. When it comes to Expedition 33, yes, you can parry, you can dodge enemy attacks during their turn, but the pace and the flow and the feel of the game at the end of the day still feel turn-based. I think a lot of arguments that try to draw up these comparisons can raise some interesting points, but they ignore the heart of the matter, and that is how the game feels to play, fundamentally speaking. And I wouldn't say Rebirth or Clay Obscure's combat is necessarily better than the other, or more robust than the other. They go for completely and fundamentally different things. And I think they both succeeded what they're trying to do. Back to the article. It's perfectly fine if fans just want a new Final Fantasy that marries expensive graphics with a traditional turn-based system, though there are no shortage of other RPGs out there, including many from Square Enix itself, that already cater to those classic sensibilities. But the combat itself is far from the weakest part of the modern entries in the franchise. What's actually holding it back, without a doubt, very authoritative, are the stories. I'm not going to relitigate every turn in each of the sprawling adventures released over the last decade. I'd argue Final Fantasy storytelling has been on the decline since the end of the PS2 generation, with Final Fantasy XII, a still stellar game for plenty of other reasons. Rebirth and 16 both had glaring issues though. Now, while I agree they have issues, I don't agree with the arguments this article is about to go into, where they act as if these specific issues ruin the overall experience. Rebirth bungles many of the original source material's most important moments without providing interesting new interpretations, tensions, or epiphanies in return. My immediate thought upon reading that is, have you played Rebirth? Because that's just not the case at all. And this isn't just, oh, there's this one specific scene that does it. No, it's throughout the entire game. You have all the additional scenes with Cloud having PTSD with Sephiroth. The entire tension between Cloud and Tifa in Rebirth specifically. Everything that's going on with Zack, Cissnei of all characters as well. The entire ending, everything that happens in Cosmo Canyon, Roach's entire story throughout Remake and Rebirth as well. I mean, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that Rebirth doesn't provide interesting new interpretations, tensions, or epiphanies in return. It provides them nearly every step of the way. At least for me, I know some people won't enjoy the additions Rebirth added to the game, but it did add additions. It did change some things. A lot of the overall plot beats largely remain the same, but when you're actually playing the game, there are a lot of changes from the original FF7 going into Rebirth. The Gold Saucer section is a perfect encapsulation. The theme park is beautifully and entertainingly recreated and chock full of fun distractions, but Barrett's backstory of having his "yes, in my backyard," I had to look that one up too, by the way, so don't worry if you didn't catch what that meant initially. Idealism exploited by Shinra to turn his hometown into a Mako harvesting dump gets short shrift and feels hollowed out. His encounter with Dine, the friend whose life he accidentally ruined, is overshadowed by a cartoony infusion of clear-cut moralism. It was one of many narrative misfires up and through Rebirth's bizarre ending. I don't even think that scene was necessarily all that bad, but I can perfectly understand why people prefer the original scene from FF7 compared to the interpretation in Rebirth. But I disagree fundamentally that this is a perfect encapsulation of the issues with Rebirth compared to the original. This to me is largely a one-off moment where you can make the argument the original handled that scene just better straight up. And compared to all the good that I believe Rebirth does for the game itself, and all the interesting plot beats and moments that Rebirth has, to reduce it to say that by and large the issues in this one scene permeate the rest of the game is just something that I fundamentally disagree with. Final Fantasy XVI faltered even more frequently. For every great character moment between Clive, Joshua, and Cid, there was something in the larger narrative about geopolitical rivalries and enslaved magic users that was either straight up dumb or borderline offensive. It never quite grapples with the stakes of its grim world building before eventually ditching it all for some old school Final Fantasy guy-in-the-sky Deus Ex Machina shit that undermines everything players had previously become so emotionally invested in. I say this with complete love for the game as a whole, which I am currently playing a second time, but FF16 lives up to its Game of Thrones influences with a third act that's every bit as disappointing as the end of the HBO series. Look, I'm not even the biggest fan of the final act of Final Fantasy XVI, but I will fundamentally disagree with the notion that it completely throws away the themes and motifs of the game up to that point. It just hyperfixates and focuses in on the themes surrounding the dominance and the icons, and whether or not the world should continue to exist with those things being such important and impactful pillars of society and the geopolitical systems of that game. I wasn't even that big of a fan of Ultima as like a villain or anything like that, and I do agree that he can come off as that guy-in-the-sky Deus Ex Machina villain, but that's also Final Fantasy. Like, I am someone who has talked about one of the biggest issues Final Fantasy has run into in recent years being that gameplay-wise, Final Fantasy doesn't have enough identity or structure or consistency. And while Final Fantasy XVI narratively, thematically, and tonally can be polarizing because of what it is, and the fact that it does feel heavily inspired by Game of Thrones, which may not be everyone's cup of tea, it is still structured in a way that feels Final Fantasy to me. It starts small and then ends off on a big go kill a god note. That is inherently Final Fantasy. And if the main takeaway of this article is that, hey, the stories are the actual biggest issue for Final Fantasy right now, I don't think telling Final Fantasy to tell a story that isn't Final Fantasy is the way to go about doing that. I don't think it builds a strong argument that it's actually the story that's the issue when you're complaining about a plot beat that is inherently Final Fantasy. We can argue about the specific execution of it, right? We can do that, and how it could have been better. But that plot beat works with the themes of the game going on, while also feeling Final Fantasy. My takeaway from Clay Obscure, then, is not that RPGs need to be turn-based to find love again, but that even a turn-based RPG can win over modern audiences. We're gonna get back to that specific wording, by the way, if the story, acting, and presentation are all top-notch. There is no reason the next Final Fantasy can't do all of those things, on top of harnessing the franchise's current combat systems. For everyone else, well, Dragon Quest XII shouldn't be that far away. Again, the conclusion here is also perfect rage bait. It feels so expertly crafted to tick people off. It's like even italicizing even here, but that even a turn-based RPG can win over modern audiences, as if the intention behind this wording is saying that turn-based is somehow lesser than a real-time combat system. I don't view one to be better or worse than the other. They do different things and provide their own unique forms of entertainment. I am not someone that will say Final Fantasy combat needs to be turn-based or needs to be real-time combat. My argument for a while at this point has been Final Fantasy just needs structure and identity. It needs a combat loop in the modern day that people will hear the words Final Fantasy, or at least modern Final Fantasy, and think of. But when it comes to each new entry, it does something completely different. So if you enjoyed something they did before, and you wanted to see iteration on those ideas that even this article talked about before with Final Fantasy 16, chances are with the way modern Final Fantasy is produced, you're not going to really see that unless it's part of a larger series within Final Fantasy like the remake games for 7. Also, this final line here, Dragon Quest XII shouldn't be that far away. Yeah, we thought that when they first announced the game, and look at us now. There's been more news about Kingdom Hearts 4. Let that sink in. And while yes, there are various moments in that article that I can somewhat agree with or see the logic to, personally speaking, it falls into the camp of not really getting to the heart of the issues people have with modern Final Fantasy. I can't speak for everyone, right? I'm just one guy on the internet. I can only really speak for my own preferences and what I think. But in my opinion, I think the biggest issue with modern Final Fantasy isn't whether it's real-time combat based, it isn't the stories, it's a lack of consistency between all the games. They feel so different and separate to one another, tonally, aesthetically, visually, and even gameplay-wise. They all have things to like about them, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't say any of the modern Final Fantasies we largely talk about in this discussion, 15, 7 Remake, Rebirth, 16, I wouldn't say any of them are bad games. I highly enjoy all of them. But they have their issues. And if you're someone that joins the series because one of those games really resonates and clicks with you, chances are you're just not going to be catered to more experiences like that in the future. If you like that variety and that sense of variance, good on you. You're probably going to love this series. Because while it can be very different, chances are the games are still going to be really good at the end of the day, even if you have issues with them. But if you're someone looking for consistency, you will probably become quickly disillusioned. Some people will view that to be a benefit of Final Fantasy. I used to be one of those people myself. And as someone who has a rather large strike zone when it comes to my video game preferences, Final Fantasy is still a series that I thoroughly enjoy. But if we want to talk about the things supposedly holding it back, I don't think it's the stories, even though sometimes they can be better, like 15 had massive pacing issues, for instance. It's just a lack of identity across the board. Having variance is fine. Final Fantasy has always had variance to some degree, but it's been ramped up to 11 in the more modern era of Final Fantasy. I like the fact that Final Fantasy is supposedly going multi-platform from here on out. I think that's a good direction shift, and while I will always want Final Fantasy to be a series that tells new and engaging stories that feel different to each other, I want them to still feel like Final Fantasy at the end of the day. And a little bit more so than they currently do. Not that they don't at all. I just want them to feel even more like Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is one of my favorite series, and it still is. Could the modern games have better pacing here and there, and slightly better execution here and there as well? Yeah, sure. But I don't think the stories they are telling are the root issues that modern Final Fantasy or Final Fantasy overall is suffering from right now. But here's where you come in. Leave a comment down below with what you want to see out of the future of Final Fantasy. Do you want to see a return to turn-based combat? Do you want to see them take one of the combat systems in the more recent games and just stick with it? Do you like the variety? Do you agree that the stories are the actual biggest issue? I'd love to hear your opinions and hear your takes and hear your perspectives. And while you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Follow me on TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter, Jmulls G. I have a Discord in the description down below. Stay safe, have a great day. And if you want to see me react to an interview Yoshi P gave about not only the future of Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy 14 as well, going all the way through 10.0, you should check out this video next. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.